Recently, while scrolling through YouTube, I saw a video from the channel Unexplained Mysteries. The video was about a declassified CIA experiment featuring Ingo Swann, Harold Sherman, and Hal Puthoff. The experiment, titled An Experimental Psychic Probe of the Planet Jupiter, was performed in 1973 in an attempt to test remote viewing. The video attempts to portray the experiment as proof of remote viewing being possible, but how true can that be? Before we get into the experiment or any of its outcomes, we must discuss the way in which it was framed, because there are heavy flaws. The video blatantly states that it was just declassified, which is misleading language attempting to portray it as recent, which is simply untrue. The project was declassified in 2008, 17 years prior to the video being released, and its experiment was talked about publicly in earlier books and publishings from Puthoff and Swann. Although that is just an issue with semantics and was likely chosen simply to motivate the viewers to click on the video without any more ulterior motives behind it. Something to do a lot is focus on the legitimacy of the experiment, emphasizing how it was done with high scientific rigor under the supervision of trained scientists, and yet they fail to name any of them. And that is for a good reason. There is only one scientist involved, Dr. Hal Puthoff. Because he was the only supervisor on the experiment, it is important to heavily scrutinize his background. Dr. Puthoff received a doctorate in electrical engineering, which is a far cry from the kind of experience required for such work. However, to his credit, he was also a self-studied parapsychologist, and most of his work in parapsychology has been found to be heavily flawed and flat-out incorrect, because he has a tendency to be manipulated. He is a Scientologist as well, and I believe we are all aware as to what Scientology is, but for those who don't, it is a cult which has been long revealed to openly manipulate and lie to their members, which immediately puts into question his academic rigor. Furthermore, a lot of his most famous experiments, especially immediately prior to the one the video talks about, involved a psychic named Uri Geller. Uri Geller has since been determined to be nothing more than a fraud, using sleight of hand and charisma to pass off psychic and paranormal abilities. These experiments, long proven to be flawed and invalid due to involvement in Geller, questions if he ever had the experience to even study the field, and calls into question the legitimacy of any experiments he has done without Geller's involvement as well. The video doesn't mention Puthoff. Instead, it heavily focuses on Ingo Swann, the main psychic of the experiment. The video does a good job talking about Swann, mostly because he is nothing more than a psychic, which means his credibility stays intact as long as he is believed to be a psychic, something which is hard to disprove. However, there is two highly important things to mention about Swann. For one, he was also a Scientologist, an extremely prolific one at that, being one of the early celebrity Scientologists, which didn't become common until years later. As I discussed earlier, Scientology immediately destroys any credibility someone might have, especially when they act as a spokesperson for it. Secondly, he received most of his legitimacy in the day and afterwards through praise from Uri Geller, who, as we discussed, was an open fraud. So immediately we can see a majority of his credibility is either destroyed or built in relation to a fraud. The video doesn't mention the second psychic involved in the experiment in any degree, but that individual is Harold Sherman, and he is perhaps the most credible and trustworthy figure of the entire experiment. Sherman was an author, most well known for his works in fictions, but beyond fiction he wrote a bunch of spiritual and psychic self-help books. He has no major controversy outside of his claim of being a psychic, which heavily lends to his credibility and the overall credibility of the experiment. But the video neglects to mention him, which is a huge flaw. Outside of Swann, Sherman, and Puthoff, there was also Russell Targ. He, like Puthoff, was a parapsychologist, but I do not believe he is that relevant to the experiment. The video leaves him out, but I find that justifiable, as he was more so a person who published the findings and was a second head, and he never really engaged or was directly involved in the experiment. But regardless, he is a well-known parapsychologist who has worked with the government numerous times, most notably on Stargate. His mentioning would have likely lent credibility to the video, but it wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, and was likely left out due to his lack of direct involvement. Now, how about the actual experiment? Well, simply put, it is flawed. The setup alone was good. Sherman was put in a focus room on the East Coast, and Swan was placed in one on the West Coast. At the same time, both individuals attempted to remote view Jupiter while writing notes about their experience that could be cross-referenced at a later date. On the surface, this can easily create a good experiment, as it isolated the subjects and allows for no cross-contamination to exist. But outside of the basic setup, there are some major flaws. Both Swan and Sherman met prior, with Swan visiting Sherman's meditation room and assisting in setting it up. Now, I am skeptical that they created a plan to deceive the experiment during this meeting, because I believe Sherman truly did, at the very least, think that he was a psychic. But what happened immediately after the remote viewing is what really calls into question the validity of the experiment. Afterwards, Swan, Sherman, Puthoff, and Targ got on a phone call where the two psychics would discuss their experiences. This is where the first true flaw in the experiment can be found. At the point of this phone call, both psychics still had their papers in their notes in hand. Sherman first read off his paper, telling everyone else what he had experienced. Between that point and the point where Swan read off his notes, it is highly plausible that Swan could have altered his notes or completely fabricated them to more closely match Sherman's results. When conducting an experiment, it is important to make sure there is no cross-contamination, but this experiment blatantly had that present, and it's because of that where Swan's entire contribution becomes invalid, as there is no way to verify the validity of his documents. The experiment was also never replicated, and Swan and Sherman were only ones involved, far from a large enough sample size to determine any outliers or legitimacy. The video emphasizes how accurate and ahead of its time claims made by Swan and Sherman is, but how accurate is it really? Pretty accurate for the knowledge of the times. The video points out two main things as proof of its accuracy. Firstly, they point out how they saw the storms of Jupiter, and how that was not known at the time, which is a blatant lie, as the storms of Jupiter have been observed as far back as the 1600s. The video, and Swan in later publications, also claimed they saw rings around Jupiter, which if true, would be astonishing, as the rings were not even discovered until 1979. But this really does not hold up under scrutiny. The document does not mention the rings in the sense that was implied. Instead, it mentions stripes of crystals all around Jupiter, while talking about its atmosphere. Something that was already known to be present, and likely originally referred to the actual color bands around Jupiter itself, and then retroactively applied to the rings discovered later to add legitimacy. Now, interestingly, the video leaves out the mention of crystals, which is a huge flaw, and it was something that was later proven by the Galileo probe missions that discovered the presence of various crystal substances in the atmosphere of Jupiter. On the surface, this should be proof of remote viewing to some degree, and the video should have brought it up, but they didn't, failing to do even a little bit of work to bring in a full context that could help bolster their claims to legitimacy. Now, the crystal of Jupiter was a great experience that could point to remote viewing, but it likely doesn't. By that point, we already knew Earth had crystals, so the assumption that Jupiter did wouldn't be far off. Now, mainstream science of the time didn't yet think Jupiter had any crystallized structures, so it could be argued that it's unlikely for them to come to the conclusion without remote viewing. However, one singular statement from Sherman, I believe, shows that was likely an inference, subconscious or otherwise, that was built off the science of the times. Sherman said there were 17 moons of Jupiter. At the time, only 12 of Jupiter's moons were discovered and known. This was groundbreaking. Sherman correctly estimated that there were more than 12 moons prior to her discovery. But Jupiter actually has 95 moons. 17 isn't that close to 95. In fact, it's way off. But it's close to 12. And the science at the time, especially in theoretical and experimental areas, often theorized that there was 5 to 10 more moons not yet discovered, which aligns with Sherman's background as a writer, where he wrote several books that took place or handled space. So it is likely that he came across these more fringe theories which would affect him subconsciously. The video also spends time talking about a secondary experiment done by someone using an alias involving Swan. I can't find documentation of that experiment online, and if it likely exists, it is likely in one of Swan's own books. Maybe in the future I'll save some money and purchase one, trying to find that experiment and talk about it in detail, but for the moment I will just skip over it. Now, this wasn't brought up in the video, but it's something I felt needed to be addressed. If this is untrue, then why did the CIA entertain it? Well, I believe there's a simple answer. It's the CIA. The CIA aren't scientists. They are security. They are also well known for entertaining outlandish ideas to one-up the Soviets, who were well known to engage in psychic research. Trusting the CIA for anything is foolish, as they are the same individuals who fed into the alien conspiracies after the Roswell incident to hide their own secrets, and the same individuals who wrote the Honduras Manual and then claimed they didn't support torture. The CIA shouldn't be treated as though they are representative of literally anything. And I ask you this: if this experiment was well done and true, then why was the CIA instead of NASA who documented it? In conclusion, I believe it's important for us to question the world around us, but I also believe that it requires cross-referencing and full evaluations. The video and the report do neither of those. Educating people is noble, and informing people of theories, no matter how fringe, is a legitimately good cause. I wish more people entertained fringe theories seriously, but to present it as fact, leave out context, and not even address the full picture, that makes it dishonest, and that takes it from education and into indoctrination. Sincerely, a concerned skeptic.